My name is Vanessa, and I never imagined I'd be telling this story, let alone living it. It began in the silent aftermath of too many funerals. My father was the first to go, taken by COVID in a wave that left no time for goodbyes. I watched as the light drained from my mother's eyes in those first days after the loss, but I believed she was strong enough to make it through. She was a former accountant, logical and reserved, resilient. But grief is never logical, and sometimes resilience just hides the cracks. After my father came my grandmother, then my aunt, then a family friend who had always been like a second mother to her. One by one, my mother's lifelines were severed, and the silence in her home grew heavier. I would call, visit, check in daily. So would my brother and her sister. Still, there are places no one can reach unless you've lived inside someone's grief. She began spending more time online. At first, I thought it was harmless. She said she was reconnecting with old friends, joining support groups for widows and grieving families. I even encouraged it. After all, what harm could come from seeking community when you're feeling isolated? It wasn't long before she mentioned a man she'd met on one of these websites, a fellow widower, a Christian man who understood the loss of a spouse, who shared scripture, who wrote long, thoughtful messages filled with empathy. She didn't tell me much about him at first. She said he was private and their relationship was still new. I assumed she was lonely, and I wanted to respect her boundaries. But slowly, what had seemed like a comfort began to cloud her thinking. My brother and I started noticing inconsistencies. She became evasive, her finances strangely stretched, though she insisted everything was fine. She had always been transparent about money, to the point of discomfort. So the sudden secrecy was jarring. Then came the packages, odd shipments, international wires, sudden withdrawals. We questioned her gently, then urgently, then in desperation. She would brush us off, saying we didn't understand, that we were overreacting. Later, I would learn that her friend had spun a tale of hardship. He claimed to be working overseas on a government contract. He said his funds were frozen, that he needed temporary help. He sent her bank details, photos, stories, promises. He told her he loved her, that they were meant to be, that God had brought them together. She believed him fully. She kept records of the money she sent, down to the cent. She tracked interest rates in a little leather-bound notebook, calculating repayment schedules with the precision of a professional. This wasn't charity in her mind, it was a loan, an investment, an act of faith in someone who, she believed, had pulled her back from the edge of despair. The numbers rose slowly, at first 5,000 here, 10,000 there, then larger amounts. By the time the bank flagged her account for suspicious activity, she had wired nearly $2 million. The police visited her. She sent them away. She called us liars when we confronted her again. My mother, the woman who had taught me the value of skepticism and responsibility, was now accusing her own children of betrayal. The man, she insisted, was real. The love was real. She could feel it. It all came crashing down when a package she sent overseas was returned with a federal alert flagged for potential money laundering. The illusion shattered. She went silent for a day, then called me at midnight. I arrived to find her sitting at the kitchen table, the returned package unopened. Beside her, the tracking number circled in red ink. Her face was pale and blank, as if a storm had passed through and emptied her out. She said she had something to tell me, and then the words spilled out in pieces. FBI, fake names, photos, money gone, everything gone. She'd already gone to the police. She'd already seen a trauma counselor. She had been prescribed medication, but nothing could undo what had happened. The financial toll was staggering. Over $2 million gone. Nearly $500,000 owed in taxes because of misreported international wires and gift regulations. Her house at risk. Her retirement vanished. We couldn't comprehend it. We lived modest lives. My brother is a high school teacher. I work in nonprofit healthcare. This was an amount of money that might as well have been imaginary, and yet it was very real, tangible in its absence. We're speaking to lawyers now. A private investigator, hoping for a miracle from the FBI. But hope feels expensive, and we've already paid too much. That was only the beginning. After the truth came out, I naively thought the worst had already passed. I believed the damage was measured in dollars, and that once we accounted for the money, we could start rebuilding. I didn't yet understand that what had been taken from my mother wasn't just her savings or her security. It was her trust, her identity, her dignity. She stopped answering the phone. She wouldn't respond to texts. She canceled follow-up appointments with the trauma counselor and avoided opening letters from the IRS. Her days blurred together. When I visited, she would be sitting in the same chair, wearing the same sweater, with the same expression, a kind of blankness that was once foreign to her face. I took over the communication with the lawyers. The first one told us bluntly that the odds of recovering anything were almost non-existent. The scammers had routed the money through dozens of shell accounts across different countries. The trail was cold. The FBI agent we spoke to was kind but firm. They were overwhelmed with cases just like this, and while they would document everything, our chances of resolution were slim. It was around that time I discovered the extent of her credit lines. Not only had she emptied her savings and liquidated investments, but she had taken out loans, some against her home, some unsecured. She had applied for new credit cards. She had refinanced. She had done it all under the belief that love was waiting for her on the other side of this sacrifice. We sat at the dining table one evening, my brother, my aunt, and I, staring at spreadsheets that didn't seem real. Every row was a transaction. Every transaction was another step into a carefully designed illusion, one that now had consequences. My brother said nothing for a long time. Then he stood up and left the room. I could hear him crying in the hallway. Not the loud kind of crying, but the stifled, wounded kind, the kind you can't comfort because it isn't about a single moment. It's about something that broke quietly over time. I began sleeping at my mother's house. I cooked for her, cleaned, answered the door when debt collectors came by. I tried to make the world feel safe again, tried to fill the house with noise, so the silence wouldn't swallow her. But she was drifting somewhere between guilt and grief, too heavy to reach. Eventually, she agreed to inpatient therapy. It wasn't easy. We had to coax her gently, without pressure. Frame it as a retreat, a place to rest. She went for 3 weeks. During that time, I learned how to handle her accounts, to freeze her credit, to work with banks to track any remnants of her money. There wasn't much. When she returned, she was changed. Still fragile, but a little clearer. She apologized to me not just for what had happened, but for not believing me. She told me she missed Dad more than anything, and that for a moment, it had felt like she was talking to him again. The scammers had mirrored his voice, his tone, his patience. She said it was like being haunted by a ghost you didn't want to let go. We started attending support groups, not just for financial abuse victims, but for families. We met others, dozens, in fact, who had been through something similar. Lonely men and women targeted by professional rings that knew how to wear the skin of trust. The legal process was slow. Every few weeks brought another letter from the IRS or a creditor. We retained a tax attorney, filed for hardship, put the house in a trust to protect it from seizure. There were moments I thought we might lose everything, but somehow we kept going, and through it all, I never stopped being angry. Not just at the scammers, but at the world that makes people like my mother invisible after a certain age. A world where loneliness is a market, where grief is an opportunity. I don't know what justice would look like. Arrests? Refunds? A public apology? None of it would return the years she lost in that fantasy, but maybe telling this story is a form of justice. Maybe if one person reads it and sees the signs, they'll ask the right question, or listen more closely, because the truth is, what happened to my mother didn't start with a scam. It started with silence. And silence, when left alone, is the most dangerous thing of all. It had been 6 months since the day my mother sat me down at that kitchen table and admitted the truth. 6 months since the package had come back and everything crumbled. In that time, the world had kept spinning, but for our family, time had taken on a different shape, warped, uneven, uncertain. We no longer measured days by calendars, but by letters from creditors, statements from attorneys, appointments with therapists. I often wondered what life might have looked like if that package had never returned. If the money laundering flag had never been raised, would it have gone on forever? Would she have drained every last ounce of her resources, chasing a ghost through a screen? She was doing better, or at least, she was surviving. We took long walks together. She started gardening again. She joined a group for senior women recovering from financial abuse and called me after each session, repeating things she had learned as if they were revelations. They were. For her, every admission, every tearful nod from someone who had also been fooled was like reclaiming a part of herself, but the consequences kept arriving. The IRS refused to clear the entire tax burden. They offered a payment plan, one that would last longer than she was likely to live. Her home was spared for now, thanks to the trust and the negotiations of our attorney, but there were no guarantees. We sold off heirlooms. She surrendered her life insurance policy. She gave up her car. Through it all, there was a numbness in me I couldn't quite shake. Anger no longer burned hot. It had cooled into something quieter, more persistent, a constant hum in my bones that came alive every time I saw an ad for a dating website aimed at widows. Every time I read a news story about another elderly person falling for the same kind of lie. One afternoon, as I was sorting through some of my mother's old documents, I found a folder she had labeled Truth. Inside were printed screenshots, hundreds of them, emails, chats, payment confirmations. She had kept it all, even after discovering the deception. I asked her why. She said she needed the evidence. Not for the police, not for the lawyers, for herself. Proof that it had been real in some way, that it hadn't just been madness, that the person she had become during those months hadn't been some stranger, but an extension of her grief, a chapter, not her whole story. We decided together to use the folder to try something we hadn't dared before, contacting a journalist, someone who could write about it, not as a sensational tale of a gullible woman, but as a warning, as a mirror, as a cry in the dark for all the people still trapped in those fake romances. The first few outlets turned us down. Too specific, they said, too common. But then a regional investigative reporter agreed to meet with us. She was kind, careful. She listened more than she spoke. And when the article came out 2 months later, my mother read it in silence from her living room chair, then turned to me with tears in her eyes. For the first time since Dad had died, she smiled without apology. People began writing to her, strangers who had seen their own lives in her words, a woman in Texas, a man in Michigan, a retired teacher in Florida. They all thanked her. Some had lost money, some had only narrowly avoided it, others had lost nothing but time and trust. But they all said the same thing. Thank you for speaking. The FBI contacted us again. They had traced some of the accounts. It wasn't enough to recover the money, not yet, but it gave us something we hadn't felt in a long time. Momentum, names, clues, a possibility. A year after everything fell apart, my mother stood at a podium in a local town hall during a financial safety seminar. She spoke quietly, simply, no theatrics, no dramatics, just the truth. The same truth that had once broken her, now reshaped into something stronger. I watched her from the back of the room, my brother beside me, my aunt, wiping her eyes. I thought about that package, that midnight phone call, that circled tracking number. I thought about how close we came to losing her completely, not just to the scammers, but to the shame, the silence, the spiral of it all. And I realized something. This wasn't just a story about money. It never had been. It was a story about absence, about what gets lost when someone you love disappears and you reach for anything to fill the hole, even if that something wears a mask. Even if that mask smiles and quotes scripture, we were rebuilding, not with wealth, not with certainty, but with honesty, and in that, somehow, we had found our way back to each other. The article changed more than we expected. In the weeks that followed its publication, the inbox we had created to handle replies began filling up with messages, some thankful, some angry, some desperate. Many were from victims or their children, or lawyers digging through similar mazes, but a few stood out. They didn't just share their stories, they named names. There was a name my mother recognized immediately. A man calling himself Daniel Gray, who had used the same backstory: widower, engineer, Christian, working overseas. The words were nearly identical to the ones that had seduced her. But these emails also included new pieces of information: a Facebook profile, an address in Ghana, a phone number linked to a shell logistics firm registered in Nigeria. That was when things began to shift again. I passed everything to the FBI contact we had, not expecting much. But within a month, they reached out and asked for a formal interview. A second investigator joined the case. They had opened a joint task force with international partners. It still felt like a long shot, but it was the first time anyone spoke about the people behind the curtain as something other than ghosts. My mother started having trouble sleeping again. She'd walk the hallway at night, her steps slow and restless. I could see something shifting in her. It wasn't fear. It was something sharper, something that looked a lot like resolve. That was when the letters began arriving, not emails, not phone calls, actual letters, handwritten, no return address. The first was just a Bible verse written in shaky ink. The second contained a photo of her with my brother from 15 years ago, printed from some long-forgotten online album. The third was empty, just an envelope with a single black feather inside. I knew what it meant. They were trying to scare her. The FBI told us to stay calm, to not respond. They opened a new file and promised to escalate it. But I couldn't sleep. Neither could my mother. My aunt started staying with her again. My brother installed security cameras. It all felt surreal. We were just a small family in a small city, dealing with a crime that had started in the shadows of the internet. Now it was bleeding into our physical lives. But even as the fear returned, my mother didn't back down. She kept attending speaking events. She partnered with an advocacy group that worked with tech platforms to report romance scams. She helped create educational material for senior centers. Her name became quietly known in certain circles, not as a victim, but as a voice. Still, there were setbacks. One of the banks that had denied her a chargeback sent a final notice demanding repayment of an overdraft. The IRS adjusted her tax penalties upward, citing a missed deadline. And in the middle of it all, her blood pressure spiked. We ended up in the ATM, waiting under fluorescent lights while machines beeped around her. I sat there staring at the clock, wondering how many years these people had taken from her. After that, I took leave from my job. I moved into her house. If this was going to drag on, I was going to be there for all of it. I set up a war room in the study, files, reports, photos, names, numbers, maps. I treated it like my full-time job because in many ways, it had become one. I wasn't chasing justice for the money anymore. I was chasing it for what they'd taken from my mother's spirit. I wanted them to know they had picked the wrong woman, the wrong family. We were far from finished. The study became our command center. Each day began with coffee, silence, and a scan of the inbox. I had spreadsheets that tracked connections between aliases, money routes, even domain registrations. I started using sticky notes on the walls to map patterns, names, wire instructions, photos that reused the same couch or bracelet or palm tree. It looked like a crime novel, but it was real. We began noticing recurring contact points, certain fake email addresses linked to the same IP blocks, bank accounts opened and closed in specific provinces, WhatsApp numbers that recycled profile pictures. Even the Bible verses followed a script often sent in the same order to different victims. I started building a timeline that stretched across 3 countries using breadcrumbs left by arrogance and routine. Every time I discovered a new link, I'd show my mother. She no longer recoiled at the evidence. She nodded, studied, remembered. Her accountant mind kicked in again, dissecting dates, looking for inconsistencies, noting language shifts. She wasn't just helping, she was part of the investigation. In early spring, the FBI invited us to a secure briefing with other families impacted by international fraud rings. We drove 4 hours to the federal building, walked past metal detectors, sat in a long conference room under artificial lighting. They showed us the scale of it: thousands of victims, billions in collective losses. Most of the scammers worked in teams, often sponsored by organized criminal networks. We weren't dealing with one man in a chat room, we were up against an industry. Still, something had shifted. One of the agents handed us a dossier and told us the task force had arrested 2 people tied to the accounts used in my mother's case. It was a small link in a vast chain, but it mattered. It was real. It was a crack in the darkness. That night, in our hotel room, my mother cried. Not like she had before. This wasn't grief or shame. It was something deeper, a release. After nearly 2 years of silence, deception, isolation, and fear, something had finally pushed back. When we returned home, I felt different. Less reactive, more focused. I reached out to a filmmaker I'd met through one of the advocacy networks and asked if she'd be willing to tell our story in a documentary. She said yes. We began planning interviews, collecting footage, digitizing the records we had assembled. At the same time, I helped my mother file a civil lawsuit not against the scammers themselves, but against one of the US-based money mules who had willingly funneled funds. We knew he was unlikely to pay damages, but we wanted the case on the record. We wanted it public. The hearing came that fall. A quiet courtroom, a tired judge. The defendant appeared via video. He denied knowing what he was doing, said he was just helping a friend, but our evidence was thorough. My mother spoke not for long but clearly. Her voice didn't shake. When the judge ruled in our favor, she looked straight at the camera. He looked away. That night, we went out to dinner for the first time in months. Just the 2 of us. No notes, no strategy, no inbox. We ordered wine, talked about my childhood, about Dad, about the garden. She wanted to rebuild. I knew there would still be bills, still be nights of uncertainty. But something in her had returned. Not innocence, not the old version of her, but someone new, forged in fire. When the documentary trailer was released later that winter, the response was overwhelming. What we thought would be a quiet, limited project quickly began circulating across social media, local news, even a few national platforms. Comments poured in, some from victims, some from their children, and more than a few from people inside government and finance who were finally paying attention. It was no longer just our story. It was becoming a lens through which people began to see the epidemic hiding in plain sight. The morning after the documentary aired nationwide, my inbox exploded. So did my mother's. Victims from every corner of the country, teachers, veterans, widows, even former law enforcement wrote to share their stories. Some had lost money. Some had lost family. All of them had lost faith in the systems meant to protect them. I didn't realize it then, but we had inadvertently become a point of contact, a beacon. We weren't just grieving anymore, we were organizing. A woman named Nadine reached out from Maryland. She had been a cybercrimes analyst until her own father was scammed and ended his life out of shame. She had left her post and started a coalition called Digital Justice. She asked if I wanted to help. I said yes before she finished her sentence. The group met virtually lawyers, psychologists, fraud experts, journalists, families. Our goal wasn't revenge, it was exposure. We wanted regulations, mandatory reporting, platform accountability, educational outreach, real change. My mother joined quietly, listening more than speaking, but her presence mattered. She was the reminder of what these crimes actually cost. She gave the numbers a face, a voice. a history. In June, we flew to DC to meet with a bipartisan panel on elder financial protection. I didn't sleep the night before. I sat in our hotel bathroom at M rehearsing what I'd say, pacing quietly so I wouldn't wake her. But when we arrived at the Capitol building and I saw her walking beside me, I found my voice again. She wore the same navy blazer she had once worn to my high school graduation. Her eyes were calm, her hands steady. I spoke first about the scam, the aftermath, the investigation we had mounted alone, the money mule who had never spent a day in jail. I spoke about my father and about silence that my mother stood. She didn't talk about the scammers. She talked about how long it took for anyone to listen, about how banks ignored her, about how the shame nearly killed her, about how it was easier for systems to believe she was foolish than to believe a billion-dollar criminal economy was thriving under their noses. When she finished, no one clapped. It wasn't that kind of room, but the silence had changed. It was heavier, a silence made of realization. After that, things moved fast. The documentary was nominated for a media award. My mother and I were invited to speak on public radio. Digital Justice released a white paper on coordinated scam activity and loopholes in platform terms of service. Several dating websites quietly updated their safety policies. One bank announced a new AI monitoring tool. Based on patterns we had helped document, none of it brought the money back. But we could feel something shifting. Then, one night in October, I got a call from our FBI contact. There had been a joint raid overseas. They had recovered hard drives, phones, banking ledgers, and names. A few of them matched the aliases from my mother's case. They weren't just ghosts anymore. They were people, real, trackable, vulnerable to justice. I hung up and walked into the living room where my mother sat reading by the window. I told her. She didn't say anything at first. Then she whispered one word. Finally. We sat in the dark for a while. No plans, no strategy, just breathing. We both knew it wasn't over, but we were finally in the fight. The raid abroad marked the beginning of the end, not of the pain, but of the silence that had allowed it to grow. The FBI now had hard drives, bank ledgers, and thousands of pages of chat transcripts. Our contacts said it would take months, maybe years, to fully unravel the network. But the names were real now. So were the accusations. A few weeks after the news broke, we were invited to speak at a cybersecurity summit in New York. My mother didn't hesitate. She said yes before she had finished reading the invitation. When we arrived at the venue, a cavernous auditorium filled with analysts, journalists, and politicians, she looked at me and smiled. I recognized that look. It was the same quiet courage she had worn the day she buried my father. She told our story again. Only this time she didn't focus on the pain. She focused on the systems, the gaps, the assumptions that allowed the hunters to operate openly. Her voice never faltered. When she finished, the applause was long and heartfelt, not of sympathy, but of respect. That night, when we got back to the hotel, he asked me if I ever thought we'd get this far. I didn't know how to answer. I had stopped measuring our progress in terms of justice or money. What we were building felt deeper, something less tangible but more permanent. Digital Justice gained momentum. The coalition morphed into an official nonprofit. We started a hotline for victims of fraud, run by volunteers who had lived through it themselves. My mother mentored new members. She became the soft, steady voice people clung to in their darkest moments. After submitting new evidence and letters of support, the IRS eventually dropped its fine. One of the banks she'd sent money to agreed to a partial settlement, and her home, once on the verge of foreclosure, was now protected by a state fraud victim assistance program. Piece by piece, everything came back. Not money, not innocence, but stability, dignity. My mother started painting again. Landscapes, mostly quiet fields, blue hills, windows full of sky. Her brush strokes were soft, her colors were warm. She never spoke of the pictures, but I understood them. Each one was a memory rewritten, A wound softened, then one spring morning, we received a letter from the Justice Department. The prime suspect in my mother's case had been formally charged. The case would proceed to trial. We would be allowed to submit a victim impact statement. We cried, not because justice had come, but because she had finally found a door to knock on. In her statement, my mother spoke of my father, of losing him, and then of losing herself, of the voice on the screen that had offered her hope in her loneliest hour and left her naked. And then she wrote, I was a widow, but I was also a woman who had lived a full life. I had raised children. I had built a career. I had balanced accounts. I was not stupid. I was grieving. I was human. And I am still here. She signed her full name. No initials. No apology. Months passed. The hearing was adjourned. We knew it would take years to finish, but something inside us had already closed. Not from pain, but from peace. One evening, as we walked in the garden behind her house, she said something I will never forget. They wanted to leave me alone, but they forgot one thing. I asked her what happened. She smiled. I raised a girl who knows how to fight. And I smiled back, because it was true. This was never just my mother's story. It was ours, and it didn't end in silence. It ended in truth. Thank you for listening to my story with me. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video for more stories.